Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University Night School. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing this evening?
Hey, pretty good, Jeff. So we picked this topic to discuss here on our Landlord University. Top 5 eviction mistakes that landlords make, and it's something that I see a lot of. The eviction process is very cut and dry, very black and white in everybody's municipality. Sometimes it doesn't always favor the landlord. I'll agree to that, but I think a lot of the problems that landlords have with evictions sometimes are self-induced problems. They're problems that somewhere along the way the landlord didn't do what he was supposed to, and got themselves into an issue now where they're having a major eviction problem. So a lot of those things are avoidable mistakes, and I definitely thought it was worthwhile to cover a lot of these mistakes here and hopefully help some landlords avoid them.
Great.
So, first mistake, number one, is waiting too long. I see this a lot of times where the landlord's just afraid to make the call to finally say I've got to go through the eviction process. I think partly they themselves don't want to go through it. Of course, you always, especially new landlord, you always want to try and give a person the benefit of the doubt. I think that most experienced landlords grow out of that after they've been burned a handful of times and start to realize you can't do that. But waiting too long is probably, I would say, the number one mistake that a landlord can make, because a lot of times you're compounding the problem. Not only are they, is the charges going up, you're pushing that timeline out longer of when you're going to be able to re-rent the place. You're giving them more time in the property, and if they're doing damages, more damages will be done. So there's a whole laundry list of things that can happen if you're waiting too long and you're afraid to pull the trigger and to make a move. That's a lot of times where landlords are going to get themselves into trouble.
Yeah. And, the biggest reason I would expect that people need to evict a tenant is usually unpaid rent or late rent.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you take that, I would expect, just off the top of my head, probably 80% of the time that people are trying to evict someone and are willing to go through the court system to evict them, that's probably usually the biggest reason why.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked before about the fact that if you set your ground rules from the beginning and you make it very clear and you hold your tenants to it, then this shouldn't be an issue. You say
Right.
your rent is due on the first of the month or before the first of the month, and it's if you're late, it's going to be this amount of a penalty, and if you're late more than 3 times or whatever you decide it's going to be, then I'm going to evict you. And if you set that ground rule from the beginning and you hold them to it from the very first time, it's going to make it clear to your tenants that you're running this as a business and you expect them to treat it as a business as well. And if they overstep those guidelines and they go beyond the grace period of 3 times or however many times you decide they can have a late payment, then at that point, start the process.
Yeah.
If they haven't paid within 7 days or 14 days, again, whatever time frame you've established at the beginning, then you start the eviction process.
And you're totally right. And the other thing to consider is somebody who's having money problems, when rent, which is likely their biggest bill in their life, when that starts to pile up, if they can't pay $1,000 now, next month they have to pay $2,000.
Mm-hmm.
That it's an impossible climb for a lot of them to get out of. So they need that little bit of time a lot of times to to couch surf and get more money or whatever their situation is, but to get out of paying rent. And so if you're the landlord, you don't want to be that person that's helping them get out of paying their rent and not enforcing any of those policies that you have, because that will happen. And
Yes.
a lot of times they dig themselves so deep that there's just no way for them to pull out of it ever. And then of course that's what makes rental collections, one of the lowest recovery rates in any collection industry, is because if somebody owes a couple of $1,000s worth of rent and then assume that they've went and got another place that they're paying rent and they're having a hard time making that rent, they'll never have an extra net $2,000 or whatever it is to help cover that back amount of rent that they owe. So the faster that you can make a move and get them out and minimize your loss, really the better it is for everybody.
Yes.
All right. So mistake number 2, you and I, Jeff, have so many times talked about this. If you're treating your landlording business like a business, you shouldn't have this problem, but we see it a lot of times. Landlords have an informal or improper notice to terminate. So, knocking on their door or making a harassing phone call saying, "Hey, you haven't paid your rent, I'm going to evict you," that doesn't count. You have to give proper notice. The courts will never let that stand up. It's best to have it in a very formal notice, use very formal words. We've always talked about keeping your emotions out of it. Leave it clear cut to the letter of the law and make sure that they're getting the right notices.
Yes. And make sure that you use the forms that are required by your state and follow the process set down by the state. And there are a lot of landlord advocacy groups in the areas. You should be able to reach out to one of them if you need to evict somebody. If you haven't already, reach out and find some of that help. They'll help you get everything in place and show you what you need to do to take the proper steps.
Yeah. So, telling a tenant, I'm going to give you, or I want you out by the end of the month, or you got till the end of the month to get out. Not good enough. It needs to be, in order to support legal action for an eviction, it needs to be in writing and it needs to have a specific date attached to it. End of the month doesn't count. It needs to be on the 30th, the 31st of, October 2014, whatever that is. Make sure that it's very, very specific.
Yes.
All right. So rolls us into mistake number 3, failing to set a deadline for a full payment, or even worse, in my opinion, failing to stick with it.
Mm-hmm.
Something that we talked about a lot, you just covered as well, is, if they know that you're not taking it serious, they're certainly not going to take you serious. But if they know that, just like a car payment or a credit card payment, if you paid late, you're going to pay late charges. And if you don't pay, you're going to get evicted, or you're going to have your car repossessed, or whatever whatever those repercussions are. If the banks, pump faked and never actually did what they said they were going to do, nobody would ever make their car payment. So you have to have that follow through to let people know you're serious about it.
Mm-hmm.
Mistake number 4, being available at all hours of the day or night. And again, another thing that we've talked about. I think that a lot of landlords sometimes cross that line of friendliness and professionalism. And of course, when you're in a situation or a relationship where you're more friends than have a professional relationship with them, evicting your buddy is a hard thing to do.
Yes, it is.
So definitely a good idea to draw those lines and stay on your side. And it doesn't mean that you have to be cold or unfriendly or anything, but make sure it's that they're well aware that you're treating this as a business, and you've got a business mind in it as well. And I think they're a lot less likely to try and take advantage in that way too.
Yes, very true.
Mistake number 5, failing to work with an attorney. And something I see a whole lot of landlords, I think, a lot of them by nature are very money wise. I think, initially they see an eviction as being a huge expense to them. And of course, they want to save money and do it themselves. And some landlords I know are pretty good with it and can get by. And I think a lot of it depends on your area and how easy it is in certain areas versus other areas, which can be riddled with all kinds of legal red tape and everything. Never a bad idea to consult with an eviction attorney. Specifically, we've talked about this in the past too. An eviction attorney, not your family attorney or an attorney that helped you with a divorce or something like that. We're talking about an attorney who understands the eviction process in your state, who has done it many times. It's part of their practice, and you're not paying that attorney to learn on your dime, essentially, on how to do the eviction process.
Yeah, it's definitely important, especially if you've never gone through it before. I can't imagine trying to do it yourself. Yeah, certainly you can read all the books and talk to all the people you want, but the process, is as much simple as it is complicated, if that makes any sense. I mean, you look at it, you think, okay, I just have to do this, 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 and this. And yeah, most of us probably could do that, but we're much better off getting a professional, as you said, somebody who specializes in evictions, because they know the process, they know the judges. It just makes it much simpler. And the first time I had to evict a tenant, that's exactly what I did. And we hemmed and hawed, went longer than we should have. We went through a lot of this stuff ourselves before we got to the point that we finally just hired an attorney. And even though we had done some of the notification the way we thought it should be done, we were starting from ground zero when we hired the attorney. And we had to start with the official notification process and move through. And when we brought him on, it was only 15 days, 3 weeks before we were done with the process, and that tenant had moved out. And if we had done that a month prior, we would have saved a month's rent, which would have practically paid for the attorney.
Yeah, and the last tip I'll throw out there before we wrap this topic up would be to find a really good an eviction attorney in your area. Simply go down to the court, take a look at all of the court dockets for the evictions for the past week or month, and take note of whose name seems to be showing up there an awful lot for the attorneys. And they're the ones who are handling most of the eviction business in the area, and it's a good starting point to get in touch with them first. And a lot of
Yes.
times too, you're going to save money by going with somebody that's their practice specialty. They're going to be a little bit more cheaper than your regular attorney. Like I said, that's going to have to do some research and learn how this process works versus somebody who's doing this every day.
Exactly. Well, great. I think that wraps up another good episode of Night School, and I look forward to talking with you tomorrow evening.
Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University, and remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at thementorimpact.com.